The stars were dying, and the Galactic Confederacy knew it had run out of time. Ambassador Thiessen stood before the High Council, his forearms trembling as he delivered the report that no one wanted to hear. The Varak swarm had consumed another 3 systems in the past lunar cycle, and the death toll had risen beyond any number their translators could express in words that still held meaning. "We have lost the Keth Ari battle fleet," he announced, his voice heavy with grief and exhaustion, "and the Meladrin psionic barriers have fallen at every engagement. The Ven adaptive warriors lasted longer than most, but even they could not survive being dissolved alive by acid that eats through any known material in the universe." The council chamber fell silent, and in that silence lived the weight of 17 destroyed civilizations. The Varaks were not like any enemy the galaxy had faced before. They were not conquerors who wanted territory or resources or slaves. They were a swarm, a mindless and endless tide of silicon-based predators that existed only to consume and multiply and spread across the stars like a plague made of razor-sharp limbs and acid blood. Every species in the Confederacy had sent their greatest warriors, their most advanced weapons, their finest ships. All had failed, and now the Orion Line stood as the last defense before the Varaks reached the core worlds where trillions of innocent beings lived in fear of what was coming. "There's one species we have not yet asked," said Counselor Vethana, her crystalline body humming with nervous energy. "The humans of Earth joined our Confederacy only 2 cycles ago, and we know little of their military capabilities." Thiessen's face twisted into something that might have been hope or might have been despair. "Earth is a small world on the outer rim, and humans are a young species with primitive technology compared to our own. What could they possibly offer against a swarm that has destroyed civilizations 1,000,000 years older than theirs?" But they had no other choice, and so the message was sent across the void of space. 3 weeks later, Ambassador Thiessen's ship entered the Sol system, and he got his first look at the pale blue world that humans called home. It looked peaceful from orbit, covered in swirling white clouds and deep blue oceans. And Thiessen wondered how such a gentle-looking planet could produce anything useful for a galactic war. He landed at a place called Geneva, where human leaders had gathered to hear his plea. General Miriam Okoye stood at the front of the assembly, a tall woman with dark skin and silver hair and eyes that had seen too many battles to count. Thiessen delivered his speech with all the desperation he felt in his heart. He told them of the Varaks and their endless hunger, of the civilizations that had been reduced to nothing but dust and screaming memories, of the billions who would die if the Orion Line fell. "We ask humanity to join the final defense," he concluded, his voice breaking with emotion. "We need soldiers, warriors, anyone who can hold a weapon and stand against the swarm. The fate of the galaxy depends on species like yours answering the call." The humans listened in silence, and Thiessen watched their faces for any sign of the fear or determination he expected to see. Instead, General Okoye smiled, and something in that smile made Thiessen's blood run cold. "Ambassador," she said, a voice calm and steady in a way that seemed almost wrong given the circumstances. "You want soldiers from Earth?" "Yes, General. We need every warrior your species can spare." Okoye looked at the other humans in the room, and they shared glances that Thiessen could not interpret. Some of them were smiling too, and others were laughing quietly in a way that made no sense at all. "We could send our own soldiers," Okoye said slowly, "and they would fight bravely and die like all the others have died. But you said you needed creatures that could survive anything, fight anything, outlast anything." "That is correct. Then we have something much better than human soldiers to offer you." She pressed a button on her console, and a holographic display appeared in the center of the room. It showed a timeline stretching back 4 billion years, marked with symbols that Thiessen did not understand. "This is the history of life on Earth," Okoye explained, her voice taking on the tone of a teacher speaking to a student who was about to learn something terrifying. "Do you see these marks here, Ambassador? What are they?" "Extinction events. Moments when most life on our planet was completely destroyed." Thiessen studied the display with growing unease. "I count 5 major events and dozens of smaller ones." "That is correct. In 4 billion years, Earth has been struck by asteroids that blocked out the sun for decades, frozen solid in ice ages that lasted millions of years, poisoned by volcanic eruptions that filled the atmosphere with toxic gas, and bombarded with radiation from dying stars. How did any life survive such catastrophes?" Okoi's smile grew wider, and Thyssen felt his heart beating faster with a fear he could not name. "That is exactly the right question, Ambassador. You see, most life did not survive. 99% of all species that ever lived on Earth are completely extinct, wiped out by conditions that would make your worst nightmares seem pleasant." She leaned forward, and her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made him want to look away. "But 1% survived, and those survivors are still here. They are creatures that evolved specifically to be unkillable, organisms that can endure conditions that would destroy anything else in the universe." "What are you saying, General?" "I am saying that you ask the galaxy for soldiers, Ambassador. Earth is going to send you the creatures we could never kill, no matter how hard we tried." She stood and gestured for him to follow. "Come with me to a place we call Project Lazarus, and I will show you what 4 billion years of death has created." As Thyssen followed her out of the chamber, he realized that he had come to Earth expecting to find allies. He was beginning to suspect that he had found something else entirely, something that the galaxy was not prepared for, something that would change everything. And for the first time since the war began, Ambassador Thyssen felt something other than despair. He felt afraid of his own allies, and somehow that gave him hope. The elevator descended for nearly 20 minutes before it finally stopped, and Ambassador Thyssen realized that Project Lazarus was buried deeper underground than any facility he had ever visited on any world. General Okoye led him through a series of security checkpoints, where armed guards scanned them with devices that hummed with energy. And finally, they emerged into a massive, underground chamber that stretched so far in every direction that Thyssen could not see the walls. "Welcome to the Ark," Okoye said, and there was pride in her voice, mixed with something that sounded almost like fear. "This is where we keep Earth survivors." The chamber was divided into dozens of sections, each one sealed behind thick glass walls and filled with environments that range from frozen wastelands to boiling pools of acid. Scientists in protective suits moved between the sections, taking notes and running experiments on creatures that Thyssen could barely see. "Before we begin," Okoye said, "I need you to understand something important about Earth. Our planet is not a paradise, Ambassador. It is a battlefield where life has been fighting against death for 4 billion years. And the creatures you are about to meet are the winners of that war." She led him to the first section, where the glass was so thick that it distorted the view inside. "These are tardigrades," she explained, pointing at creatures that looked like tiny bears with 8 legs and no eyes. "On Earth, they are microscopic, smaller than the tip of a needle. But our scientists have found ways to grow them much larger. What makes them special? They cannot be killed by anything we have ever tried. We have frozen them to temperatures colder than empty space, heated them to temperatures that would melt steel, exposed them to radiation levels that would vaporize organic matter, and even shot them into the vacuum of space without any protection." Thyssen stared at the creatures with growing disbelief. "And they survived all of this?" "They did not just survive, Ambassador. They barely noticed. Their bodies enter a state we call cryptobiosis, where they shut down all biological functions and become essentially immortal until conditions improve. That is impossible on any other world. Yes. On Earth, It is simply Tuesday. She moved to the next section, where long worm-like creatures swam in tanks of murky water. These are planarian worms, and they possess the most terrifying ability in the known universe. If you cut one in half, both halves regenerate into complete organisms. If you cut one into 100 pieces, you get 100 new worms. Surely there must be some way to destroy them permanently. Okoi shook her head slowly. We have tried everything, Ambassador. We have dissolved them in acid, burned them to ash, and even erased their memories with chemicals. In every case, they grew back. And here is the truly frightening part. She paused, and her voice dropped to almost a whisper. Their memories survive the regeneration. Cut off their heads, and the new head remembers everything the old one knew. We do not understand how this is possible, but it is true. Thiessen felt his legs growing weak, but Okoi was already moving to the next section. This tank contains Deinococcus radiodurans, a bacteria that can survive radiation levels 15,000 times higher than what would kill any other organism. We call them the immune because nothing in the universe can poison them. How can such a thing exist? Evolution, Ambassador. On Earth, survival is the only law that matters, and these bacteria evolved to repair their own DNA faster than radiation can damage it. We have engineered them into a hive mind that can communicate and coordinate. And we believe they can neutralize the Virax communication signals. The next section contains something that looked like a floating jellyfish. Beautiful and delicate and glowing with soft blue light. This is Torotopsis dohrnii, and humans call it the immortal jellyfish. When it grows old or suffers injury, it does not die like other creatures. Instead, it reverses its own aging and becomes young again. It can live forever? In theory, yes. We have given these creatures intelligence and accelerated their life cycles, so they experience thousands of years of life in just a few months. They remember everything from each cycle, which means they have accumulated more tactical experience than any general in the history of warfare. Thiessen was struggling to process what he was seeing. But Okoi led him to the final section, where something was pacing behind the glass with an energy that seemed almost violent. And this, she said, is the creature that even the other survivors are afraid of. Behind the glass was an animal about the size of a small dog, covered in coarse fur and equipped with claws that looked like they could tear through metal. It stared at Thiessen with small, angry eyes that held no fear whatsoever. What is it? We call it a honey badger. It is resistant to venom that would kill any other mammal, immune to pain that would cripple any other creature, and so aggressive that it attacks enemies. Many times it sighs simply because it refuses to accept that it should be afraid. It sounds dangerous, Ambassador. This creature has been documented attacking lions, fighting off packs of hyenas, and eating venomous snakes like they were candy. We enhanced them with armored skin and sharper claws, and now they serve as our shock troops. She turned to face him directly, and her expression was completely serious. The Virax use fear pheromones to paralyze their enemies before attacking. Our tests show that these pheromones make the honey badgers even angrier. Thiessen looked at all the sections around him, at the creatures that should not exist, at the survivors of a world that seemed designed to kill everything on it. General, he said slowly, I came here expecting to recruit soldiers. And what do you think now? I think I understand why humans conquered your planet so quickly. You did not become the dominant species because you were the strongest or the smartest. Then why did we? Thiessen looked at her with new understanding in his eyes. You became dominant because everything else on your world was too busy trying to kill each other, and you were simply the survivors who learned to build tools first. Okoi nodded, and her smile returned. Now you understand, Ambassador. Earth does not produce warriors. Earth produces survivors, and there is nothing in the universe more dangerous than a creature that refuses to die. She extended her hand in the human gesture of agreement. "So tell me, Ambassador Thiessen, does the Galactic Confederacy want our help or not?" Thiessen took her hand and shook it firmly. "Send your creatures, General. Send them all, and may the stars have mercy on the Varax, because I do not think your survivors will." The Battle of Thiessen's Gate was supposed to be the last stand of the Galactic Confederacy, the final desperate defense before the Varax swarm broke through to the core worlds. 3 massive fleets had already died here, their wreckage floating in the void like the bones of metal giants. The Varax had torn through Keth-Uri warships like paper, dissolved Meladron shields with acid that burned through anything, and overwhelmed Ven warriors with numbers so vast that they blocked out the stars themselves. Admiral Cothran of the Confederacy Defense Force stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the sensor displays with growing despair. The swarm was approaching in a wave that stretched across 3 light minutes of space, billions upon billions of razor-limbed predators moving with a hunger that could not be satisfied. "Admiral," his communications officer called out, "the human transport ships have arrived." Cothran turned to look at the display, and his heart sank even further. There were only 12 ships, each one barely larger than a cargo hauler, and they looked completely inadequate for the battle ahead. "That is all they sent?" he asked in disbelief. 12 transports against a swarm of billions? "The human general is requesting permission to deploy, Admiral." Cothran wanted to refuse, wanted to send the humans away before they were slaughtered like all the others. But what choice did he have? "Permission granted," he said heavily. "May the stars protect them, because I cannot." The transport ship airlocks opened, and Cothran watched his sensors to see what kind of soldiers would emerge. What he saw made no sense at all. The first creatures to exit the transports were massive beings that looked like armored tanks with legs, their bodies covered in plates of what appeared to be organic metal. They moved slowly but steadily into the void, not wearing any spacesuits, not carrying any visible weapons. "What are those things?" Cothran demanded. "The humans call them the Tardigrade Legion, Admiral. Our scans indicate they are completely unprotected against vacuum. They will die in seconds." But the tardigrades did not die. They continued moving forward, their bodies seemingly unaffected by the freezing cold and crushing emptiness of space. The Varax noticed them immediately, and a swarm of thousands broke away from the main force to intercept. They surrounded the tardigrades and began spraying them with the acid that had melted through every material in the known universe. Cothran watched in horror, expecting to see the creatures dissolve into nothing. Instead, the tardigrades kept walking. Their armor sizzled and smoked where the acid touched it, but the damage healed almost as fast as it appeared. They reached out with massive claws and began crushing Varax drones by the dozens, moving through the swarm like giants wading through a river of insects. "Impossible," Cothran whispered. But the battle was only beginning. From the second wave of transports came creatures that looked like enormous worms, their bodies twisting and writhing as they propelled themselves through space. The Varax turned their attention to these new enemies and tore them apart with savage efficiency. Cothran watched pieces of the worms floating in the void, and for a moment he thought the humans had made a terrible mistake. Then each piece began to move on its own. They grew new heads, new tails, new bodies, and within minutes the dozen worms had become 100, then 1,000. "Admiral," his sensor officer said with a voice that trembled, "the worm creatures are multiplying. Every time the Varax destroy one, more appear in its place. How is that possible?" "I do not know, Admiral, but they are already inside 3 Varax hive ships. And our scans show they are consuming the enemy from within the Varax queens. The massive intelligence centers that coordinated the swarm's attacks began emitting powerful radiation bursts to rally their forces and reorganize the assault. But something strange was happening. The signals were being absorbed before they could reach the swarm, and the Varax drones were beginning to move in confused random patterns. "Admiral, we are detecting clouds of microscopic organisms surrounding the Queen ships. They appear to be feeding on the radiation." Catherine stared at the display in wonder. The humans had sent bacteria into battle, and the bacteria were winning. At the center of the human formation, a group of glowing creatures that looked like beautiful jellyfish were coordinating the entire assault. They moved with perfect precision, always knowing exactly where the Varax would attack next, always positioning their forces in the right place at the right time. "How do they know what the Varax will do?" Catherine asked. General Okoy's voice came through the communication channel, calm and almost amused. "Those are immortal commanders, Admiral. They have lived through this battle 10,000 times in their accelerated life cycles. They have already seen every move the Varax could possibly make, and they know how to counter all of them." The battle raged for hours, and slowly but surely the impossible was happening. The Varax were being pushed back. Their acid could not kill the tardigrades. Their claws could not permanently destroy the planarians. Their radiation signals could not pierce the bacterial clouds. And their tactics could not surprise commanders who had already experienced every possible version of this fight. Then the Varax made a desperate move. They sent their most elite warriors, their fastest and deadliest drones, in a massive charge designed to break through the human lines and reach the Confederacy fleet behind them. General Okoy's voice came through again, and this time there was something dangerous in her tone. "Admiral Catherine, I am going to deploy our final unit now. I want you to know that I tried to hold them back as long as possible, but the situation requires their involvement." "What final unit?" "The Honey Badgers. I apologize in advance for what you are about to witness. From the last transport ship came creatures that were smaller than the others, covered in dark fur and equipped with claws that gleamed like blades. There were only 100 of them, and they seemed tiny compared to the massive Varax elite warriors bearing down on them. The Varax released their fear pheromones, the chemical weapons that had paralyzed every species they had ever encountered. The honey badgers breathed in the pheromones, and then they did something that no creature in the history of the Varax swarm had ever done. They got angry. They charged directly at the elite warriors, screaming with rage that the sensors picked up even in the vacuum of space. They tore through Varax drones with a ferocity that made even the tardigrades stop and stare. They bit, clawed, and ripped their way through the enemy with absolutely no regard for their own safety. One honey badger was impaled on 3 Varax claws at once, and it responded by eating the face of its attacker before pulling itself free and attacking the next enemy. The Varax elite warriors, the most feared predators in the galaxy, broke formation and fled. The Battle of Theson's Gate ended 6 hours after it began, and for the first time in 2 years, the Galactic Confederacy had won a complete victory. Admiral Catherine sat in his command chair, surrounded by his officers who were too shocked to speak. "What did we just witness?" he finally asked. General Okoy's response came with a hint of a smile. "You witnessed 4 billion years of evolution, Admiral. You witnessed what happens when a planet tries to kill everything on it and fails. You witnessed Earth." She paused, and her voice grew serious. "And this was just the beginning." News of the victory at Theson's Gate spread across the Galactic Confederacy like fire through dry grass, and everywhere it went, it carried 2 emotions that had never before existed together: hope and terror. The Varax had been defeated for the first time in recorded history. The swarm that had consumed 17 star systems had been pushed back by creatures from a small blue planet on the outer rim of the galaxy. But as the celebrations faded and the reports began to circulate, the other species of the Confederacy started to ask questions that made them deeply uncomfortable. What kind of world could produce creatures that could not be killed by acid, by radiation, by vacuum, by fire, by cold, or by any weapon the galaxy had ever invented. What kind of evolution could create organisms that grew back from pieces, that reversed their own aging, that thrived on conditions that would destroy anything else? And most troubling of all, if Earth could create such nightmares without even trying, what would happen if the humans ever decided to try? Ambassador Thiessen requested a private meeting with General Okoye aboard her command ship, and she agreed to see him in her quarters. He found her sitting at a desk covered with papers and holographic displays, looking tired but satisfied. She gestured for him to take a seat across from her. "Ambassador," she said warmly, "I hear the Council is very pleased with our performance at Thiessen's Gate." "They are grateful," Thiessen said carefully. "But they are also concerned." "Concerned about what?" "Your creatures, General. They are effective beyond anything we imagined, but they also disturb us greatly. We have never encountered life forms that treat death as merely an inconvenience, and we do not know how to feel about having such beings as our allies." Okoye leaned back in her chair and studied him with those dark, knowing eyes. "You want to know if we can control them?" "Yes. The answer is no," she said simply. "We cannot control them any more than you can control a storm or earthquake. What we can do is point them in a direction and give them a reason to go there." Thiessen felt his blood run cold. "And what happens when the war is over and they have no more enemies to fight?" "That is a question we have been asking ourselves for millions of years, Ambassador. On Earth, predators do not stop being predators when their prey runs out. They adapt. They find new food sources. They evolve." She stood and walked to a window that showed the stars outside. "But I want you to understand something about our creatures. They are not weapons we built in a laboratory. They are survivors of a world that has been trying to kill them for longer than your species has existed. They do not fight because they want to destroy. They fight because survival is the only thing they know. That does not comfort me, General. It is not meant to," she said quietly. "It is meant to help you understand. Far away, in the cold darkness between stars, something ancient was thinking. The Varax Overmind had existed for millions of years, a vast intelligence that controlled the swarm through radiation signals and chemical commands. It had consumed countless civilizations, absorbed their knowledge, and grown stronger with each conquest. Never before had it encountered prey that did not fear death. The Overmind processed the data from the Battle of Thiessen's Gate over and over, searching for patterns, looking for weaknesses, trying to understand how the creatures from Earth had done what no other species had ever accomplished. It ordered its researchers to access every database the swarm had ever consumed, every piece of knowledge from every civilization they had destroyed, looking for any information about the planet called Earth. What it found made the Overmind do something it had never done in its million-year existence. It felt fear. The fossil record of Earth told a story of endless death and destruction. Asteroid impacts that filled the sky with dust and blocked out the sun for decades. Volcanic eruptions that poisoned the atmosphere with toxic gases. Ice ages that froze the ocean solid. And mass extinctions that wiped out most life on the planet not once, not twice, but 5 times. And yet life had survived every catastrophe. It had adapted, evolved, and grown stronger with each disaster. The Overmind calculated the probability of any organism surviving even one of these events and found it to be almost impossible. The probability of surviving all of them was so small that mathematics could barely express it. But the creatures fighting its swarm were the descendants of those impossible survivors. They were the winners of an evolutionary lottery that had been running for 4 billion years, selecting only the most unkillable organisms at every turn. The Overmind understood, finally, why its fear pheromones had not worked. Fear was a tool the predators used against prey to make them easier to catch and kill. But the creatures of Earth were not prey. They had never been prey. They were survivors of a world where everything was trying to kill everything else all the time. They did not fear death because they had already faced it 1,000,000 times and won. The Overmind made a decision that no Varax queen had ever made before. It ordered a retreat from 3 star systems. This was not surrender. The Varax did not understand surrender. It was a strategic withdrawal to study the enemy and find weaknesses. But as the Overmind searched through Earth's history for any vulnerability it could exploit, it discovered something that terrified it even more than the creatures themselves. 99% of all species that had ever lived on Earth were extinct. The survivors fighting the swarm were not just unkillable. They were the winners of a competition that had eliminated almost every other form of life on their planet. They had not survived by being peaceful or cooperative. They had survived by being better at killing and adapting than everything around them. And now they had been given intelligence, weapons, and a reason to fight. The Overmind calculated the probable outcome of a continued war against Earth survivors and found the answer deeply disturbing. The Varax could not win through attrition because the enemy could not be worn down. They could not win through fear because the enemy could not be frightened. And they could not win through overwhelming numbers because the enemy multiplied faster than they could be destroyed. For the first time in its existence, the Varax Overmind considered the possibility of negotiation. Back on the Confederacy command ship, General Okoye received a message that made her smile. "Ambassador Thiessen," she said, "I think you should come see this. The Varax are retreating from 3 systems, and our long-range sensors detect something we have never seen before." "What is it?" "A communication signal from the Varax Overmind. They want to talk." Thiessen stared at her in disbelief. "The Varax have never communicated with any species except to demand surrender. They have never fought Earth survivors before," Okoye replied. "I believe we have taught them something new today. What did you teach them?" Okoye turned to face him, and there was no smile on her face now, only the hard expression of someone who understood the true nature of survival. "We taught them that there are some things in the universe that refuse to die, no matter how hard you try to kill them. We taught them that 4 billion years of evolution cannot be defeated by a swarm that is only 1,000,000 years old." She paused and looked out at the stars. "We taught them to be afraid, Ambassador. And that changes everything."